All right, we are ready whenever you are.
Yes, Your Honor. Your Honor, opposing counsel, members of the jury. The choices that the defendant made was all a part of her plan. Today's case was about blame. The defendant is blaming an undercover officer for the actions that she took. The members of the jury, we know that on April 16, 2015, the defendant, of her own free will, chose to bribe the gambling commission chair, Mr. Covington, with $250,000 in exchange for his vote. The defendant chose to make this case about blame. Now, in defense, they came before you and they tried to convince you that the defendant only thought about this bribe days before April 16th. Members of the jury, we now know conclusively that it was the defendant's plan from February 13th to April 16th. And every choice, every decision, every single action that the defendant made was all a part of that plan. Members of the jury, we as the state, we have a burden of proof in today's case. We had to prove to you, beyond a reasonable doubt, the defendant had a predisposition to commit this crime. Now, when I say beyond a reasonable doubt, members of the jury, that does not mean all doubt. It simply means a doubt based upon common sense or reason. And when I say the defendant had a predisposition to commit this crime, it means that without Officer Keenan, without his influence, the defendant would have been willing to commit this crime. So members of the jury, I want you to follow along with me with the evidence. I want you to follow the evidence with me. We're going to look at every step, every action, every single choice the defendant made from February 13th to April 16th, and we will see the defendant's choices. Members of the jury, let's start with February 13th, 2015. Because today, we called 3 witnesses to the stand. Mr. Keenan, and he told you exactly why he started to investigate the defendant. On February 13th, he was in the commissioner's office, and he heard the defendant call Chase Covington. The defendant said, I'm putting together a proposal, and I want to talk to you about it, to, grease the wheels. Mr. Covington, his voice changed. He started to get nervous. He knew exactly what she meant by that. He said, I'm in here with the staffer. I'll call you back later. Members of the jury, 3 days later, February 16th, the defendant is on a phone call. Thank you for calling me back. I'm putting together the proposal, and I just want to get it done. If you are for sale, I am willing to pay the price, whatever it is. I just want to get this sorted out. So members of the jury, in February, the defendant, she already had the plan to bribe the commission. Members of the jury, today you heard that Officer Keenan said the first time he had ever met the defendant was on March 31st. So a month and a half before the defendant and Officer Keenan even met, the defendant, she had a plan. That's predisposition, members of the jury. So let's turn to March 31st. The first interaction between Officer Keenan and the defendant. Both Officer Keenan and the defendant and Corey Hyde, they took that stand today and they told you no one mentioned a bribe in that conversation. No one said anything about giving money to the commission. Members of the jury, when the defendant, she took that stand today, she told you, well, from what they said, I got the feeling that I needed to bribe Chase Covington. Members of the jury, no one told her to do that. She got that thought of her own free will. So let's talk about the next meeting. That was on April 13, 2015. And there is a napkin in that meeting. And you have it in front of you. And members of the jury, Officer Keenan simply said he gave her a napkin and a pen. Members of the jury, that was the opportunity. The defendant's choice was to write on it. She chose to write, yes equals 150K. She tried to negotiate a bribe. Chase Covington, he looked at it, and he gave it back to her. And members of the jury, what the defendant did in that moment is very crucial because at that moment she had another choice. She could have stopped. She could have said no. She could have walked away. She could have closed the meeting. Members of the jury, at that point, she crossed out the 150K. She wrote a higher dollar amount, 250K. Members of the jury, did we ever hear Officer Keenan say that someone told her to write a higher dollar amount? No. No one told her to do anything, but the defendant, she made a choice. And she wrote 250K. Members of the jury, she followed up on that promise because on April 16, 2015, her executive assistant saw her in her office by herself. Officer Keenan was not there. She was loading $250,000 into a black briefcase. She carried that black briefcase down to room 312. In room 312, Officer Keenan and Corey Hyde were there. You heard today that Chase Covington, he didn't come to that meeting. From there, the defendant left. She left with $250,000 and she went to the VIP room. She gave Chase Covington that money. Ms. Del Cesso, she took the stand today and she told you that Officer Keenan was nowhere around when this transaction happened. Members of the jury, it is clear today that the defendant, of her own free will, made this choice. And every single choice the defendant made was all a part of a plan to get her casino approved. As members of the jury, the defendant, she took that stand, she told you today, the only reason why I went through with this bribe is because my casino was going to be in the red. She told you today that she needed this bribe to go through. She needed her casino to be approved. And members of the jury, the defense, they want you to believe and that she was coerced. And she was forced to give this bribe, but members of the jury, we know that's not true. If you take out Officer Keenan and the informant out of the equation, members of the jury, you still have Mr. Covington, $250,000 in the defendant. That all equals approval. Approval for a casino license that the defendant took that stand. She told you she didn't want, but that she needed, because there was no way that she was going to let the black bear fail. Members of the jury, we have proven to you beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant, of her own free will, was predisposed to commit this crime. Members of the jury, if that's not enough, we have this wiretap conversation. And you have this, and when you go back to deliberate, you can read it for yourself. Members of the jury, the defendant's own words to Chase Covington, we've been doing this kind of thing for a long time. I mean, it doesn't take Mickey to clue me in that sometimes you have to get your hands dirty in Midlands. Members of the jury, she admits to it. And that is why we have proven our burden today. And now the defense, they raise an affirmative defense of entrapment. And they have to come before you and they have to prove to you that Officer Keenan forced the defendant to make this bribe. Members of the jury, they have not had any evidence that would suggest the defendant was forced to make this bribe. Dr. Warren, he talked about the subtle hints that was dropped. He talked about the opportunities that the defendant had. And ultimately, she latched onto those hints. She chose to bribe the commission. It was her choice. Members of the jury, from February 13th to April 16th, the defendant, she had choices. And the choices that the defendant made, they were all a part of her plan. Find her guilty for the actions that she took. Thank you.